Very much. And again, I want to thank Dennis for the great messages we've had, and we'll have one more from Dennis, and then we will sing "To God Be the Glory" from memory, because you all know how to do that. We may sing it. Julie, you may accompany us. We may just do it a cappella, because I think we can do that too, right? All right. So, but first of all, I want to just talk a moment or so about classical Christian education, Christian liberal arts, or just plain old education, because that's what it was, right? 120 years ago, that's what education was, classical and Christian. And so we'll just call it education. And I want to just first of all say this. We are doing education in Rafiki, but I want to say once more, our main mission is to help people know God through the Bible, through the study of the Bible. And it permeates everything we do, right? Only the gospel saves and truly transforms. Only the gospel. We know that. However, we have been given a great treasure in our curriculum, our school curriculum from preschool to grade 12, and our teacher training material, 3 years of college level material, right? It's a great treasure, and it's something we want to use. And God has opened the doors for us to run our own 10 schools, right? You heard great testimonies this afternoon of how the education is impacting these young people. So if we're going to do education, what the education we want to do is classical and Christian. We don't want to do any other kind of education. And I'm going to tell you why, a little bit more about that. And so I wanted to just mention that to you. Education doesn't save, but if we're going to couple it with a Christian education, let's choose the kind of education that supports truth, beauty, and goodness, and cultivates wisdom and virtue. And that is classical Christian education. Nothing else out there, no other paradigm does it as well as that. That is education. You know, Albert, if the Africa wants critical thinking and values, which is what you read in all of their Ministry of Education material, all 10 countries, we want critical thinking, we want values. Well, that's classical Christian education. So the question I'm going to answer here is, what does Athens have to do with Abuja? What does, Abuja, Nigeria, what does Athens, what do the classics have to do with Africa? And those of you who live out there and you've been doing this for a while, you probably know these reasons. But I hope this will give you a little bit more firepower when you talk to people in Africa and in America about this, because you get that question, don't you? Right? You get that question. And for those of you who live here who aren't as familiar with classical education, and why it will work in Africa, and why it's what the church in America needs to be doing in its buildings as well, it will help you answer that question for anybody. I recently read a headline from the allafrica.com, and here's what the headline read. South Sudan, teach us how to become carpenters. South Sudanese want to shape their future. This was January this year. Teach us how to become carpenters. South Sudanese want to shape their future. The article went on to say, a young man in his 30s who told us that his hometown needs more airdrops of food. Don't just give a man a fish, teach him. He says, can you teach us how to become carpenters, he asks. He added that woodworking would be a popular source of livelihood for the men. Another man chimed in and he said, your food helps us survive, but a job would give us a future. My question is this: is that all that is needed for human beings? Is that all that is needed to shape a country's future? Simply vocational skills and job training? Is that all that is necessary? Why should a Sudanese explore Socrates and Shakespeare when really he just needs to survive? Now look, the Sudan is an extreme case and definitely needs the basics in place. Nobody is denying that, right? You need food and you need the basics and all. But what about our other 10 countries? Is it so far-fetched that the liberal arts aren't applicable to our other 10 countries in Africa. So I want to address a couple of quick concerns. First of all, are the liberal arts universal, or is it only relevant to the West, meaning Europe and America? And is not a vocational education more useful? Let's just teach them how to do computers, because computers are the future, right? I'm contending that a liberal arts education is not only appropriate for Africa, but absolutely essential for its future. Not only appropriate, but absolutely essential for the continent to thrive. And for several reasons. First of all, it is the best education for cultivating human beings. Secondly, it's the best education for developing free societies. Thirdly, it is an education that can unify a country. It can unify a people. And yes, you know what? It will at the same time cultivate great carpenters, as well as great farmers, as well as great theologians. Classical Christian education is the best education for Africa, for America, and for the world. Just ask Peter Kania from Kenya, and I'll quote him later on. So let's talk about that. It's the best education for a human being. Why do you say that, Karen Jean Elliott? First of all, let me just give you a quick reason. The other educational model out there pretty much is called progressive education, right? And it basically teaches someone to do one thing, perhaps, trains them for a specific skill. And in these days, teaching to a test. Whereas a classical education trains a person to learn how to do anything. Trains you, educates you enough to learn how to do anything. A liberal arts education also aims to cultivate wisdom and virtue. The thing we need to understand, and those of you who aren't familiar with this, need to realize 2,500 years ago, the education of the Greeks and the Romans right there, they were aiming toward wisdom and virtue, not just job training. They wanted to cultivate wisdom, not just knowledge and data. That's what they were after, and virtue. And that is what cultivates human flourishing. We have, as human beings, an inbuilt longing to know. We're made in the image of God. Now, He's omniscient. We're not. But we have this desire to know, to learn. Aristotle said this, and I'm going to do a little quoting from a couple of Greeks and Romans here, so get with the program. He said, to learn something, this is great, it's a great quote. He says, to learn something is the greatest of pleasures, not only for the philosopher, but to the rest of mankind, however small their capacity. So through carpentry, one can know something, and beautiful things, don't get me wrong, and learning to do that. But then let's develop one's capacity to know more things than just that. The liberal arts does that. Now, let me give you a qualifier here, though, right? We're all afraid of the fact that, well, the liberal arts can be dangerous pursuing that. You can become some intellectual elite. You can become a clever devil, right? I think that was C.S. Lewis who said that. However, let me just say this. The liberal arts do provide a disciplined exploration of truth and beauty and goodness. And it does prepare the heart for virtue, wisdom, and noble actions. That's what they were aiming toward. That's what Cicero said. The Bible teaches us this. The Bible says, Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind and strength. If I'm only using my mind to the bare minimum to learn how to do a computer, how am I going to really love the Lord with all of my mind? The liberal arts will help with that. So we shortchange people by just giving them the bare minimum in education. And frankly, one of the things we've inherited from Rosemary Jensen and the establishment of Rafiki is that we want to give Africa the best, right? We want to help people know God and raise their standard of living with excellence and integrity, the best. And classical Christian education is the best education we can give them. One other thing I want to mention in talking about it being the best education for human beings, it is suitable to us and how we are made. Friends, we are not just tools. We are souls. So if I'm just so focused on getting you to do something, just to do one thing, I'm almost treating you like a tool, like a hammer or a screwdriver or a vacuum cleaner, but we are souls. Classical Christian education cultivates souls. As I mentioned earlier, it is advantageous because the liberal arts does more than just teach you how to do one thing. It teaches you how to learn to do anything. What is happening in our environment now? If you teach me how to use Teams today, a week from now, it's going to change. And if I don't know how to learn something new, if I don't have that even inquiring, curious mind to do that, I'm going to be stuck. Because what I learned, if you learned Word at Microsoft, if you learned DOS, and that's, and you didn't learn how to learn anything else, you are stuck. You cannot use a computer. With the rapidly changing economies of the world, a liberal arts education is a better preparation for the future, isn't it? Isn't that right? Absolutely. Ben Sass said that. Computer courses come and go. However, Plato's dialogues, if you read them, are still relevant. So it's the best education for a human being. Secondly, it's the education for free men and free societies. You all know this, right? In the classical Greek and Roman culture, they viewed vocational education as the education for slaves. That's what the slaves did, right? And that's all they got. It was the free man who got the liberal arts education. Why continue to educate people only for the work of slaves? Why do that? Why not provide an education that fosters freedom from within and without? An education that pursues wisdom and virtue frees you from within. Now, it's Jesus, it's the gospel that really does it, but this can set the table a little bit. The philosophers and thinkers of antiquity were exploring the big questions. They were asking, what is virtue? What is justice? What is temperance? What does it look like? And they were looking for an ideal, not 50 different ways that you think it is, and you think it is, and not again, you get a car and you get justice. I mean, but what is justice? What is temperance? What does it really look like? Let me tell you something. If you read Dante's comedy, you're going to examine yourself. Aren't you? Which one of these vices is me? If you read through that, and that is not the Bible necessarily. However, in reading that, you'll be wondering, am I living a virtuous life, or am I like one of the characters in the Inferno? So a liberal arts education exposes you to that, and it can free a human being from themselves. If you're a student at a classical Christian school, you're reading literature, studying music and art that is pursuing a standard of truth, beauty, and goodness. The progressive model says truth is relative. Alan Bloom said in 1980 in his book, Closing the American Mind, this is what he said. He said, every college student who comes in now believes truth is relative. That was 1980. What do we have now? I create my own reality. That's what we have now. And that's the progressive model. And here in America, they are doubling down on all of this. That's why we need classical Christian schools in church facilities where you have empty classrooms. And that's why we need to do it in Africa, because, by the way, that same philosophy from America is ending up being dropped in every one of our 10 countries with money attached. You got to adopt this thinking, whether it's the gender issue or whether it's critical theory or whether it's abortion, and it's got money attached. You adopt this, you get support from us. You don't, well, money dries up. And we heard that was the same way with the church even. So, however, the classical Christian education pursues a standard of truth, beauty, and goodness. The modern progressive education does not. So how can you aspire to anything if you have nothing to aspire to? We heard this earlier. The greatest hindrance to development in Africa is the lack of accountability, the lack of integrity. I think we heard this earlier. Corruption is a challenge in the continent of Africa. Imagine young men and women who are aspiring to wisdom and virtue and changed and transformed by the gospel, and what that can do for corruption in Africa and righting the immorality in this country. So it's the education of free men and thinkers. And not only are you free within yourself, but it also helps the society to be free from domination. Many new colonial powers are moving into Africa, right, Albert? You've got the Chinese. You do have the Muslims moving in. If the African countries want to avoid another round of colonization, the liberal arts tradition provides a way because it is the education for free human beings. Another objection to a liberal arts education resides in its emphasis on Western civilization and its perceived lack of connection to the African culture. Now, I can talk a little bit about how it originated in a market. It originated in the wrestling matches. There's some things about how it originated that really will resonate more with Africans than it will with us, more of an agrarian society. But here's the point I want to make. 50% of Africa is what? Affiliated with Christianity, right? 50% of the people claim to be Christians. Well, what was the education of the church for 2,000 years? Classical Christian education. From the early church so the value of the classics has been recognized within the church, and so it will resonate with Africans because the church, the history of the church, the education of the church, if you're a Christian, you want the education of the church. And since 50% of Africa is Christian, this should resonate with the African people. The Apostle Paul was probably classically educated, perhaps. But because he quoted the Greek poets 3 times. Augustine, we all know about Augustine, the North African bishop. He did commend reading the works of philosophers that were true. Now, of course, he also would be very concerned about too much intellectualism because he did dabble in just about everything. So it needs to be within the context of the Bible. Another early church father said this. He said, philosophy is a preparation or a preparatory process. It opens the road for the person whom Christ then brings to his final goal. Don't you love that? Other early church fathers justified studying the pagan authors, likening it to the Israelites, who when they left Egypt, God said, I'll have the Egyptians give you their gold and their jewels, the plundering of the Egyptians. So that they used that then to build and to decorate the tabernacle. It's called the plundering of the Egyptians, the riches of the pagans. Augustine himself was classically trained and therefore was able to refute Pelagian heresies. He had the logic and the rhetoric, the ability to write those arguments because of the type of mind it develops. Augustine says in his book on Christian doctrine, he says this, if those who are called philosophers and especially Platonists have something that is true and it is in harmony with our faith, we are not only to shrink from it, but we should claim it for our own use from those who have unlawful possession of it. They've got this truth, let's claim it and let's use it for our use. You all know, I talk about this almost every year. I'm always fascinated with what happened in the 9th century with Charlemagne. And Charlemagne, dealing with an illiterate clergy. You know about this. It's the 800s. The clergy are illiterate. He's concerned about that. What does he do? He gets a classical Christian scholar, several of them. What do? They re-implement the trivium, the quadrivium, the classical Christian education. You know that. You know that bit of history. It's documented not only in history books, but mission history. And I'll tell you why. This is so exciting to me every time I read it. First of all, what this did is it cultivated the Carolingian Renaissance. And during this period, there was an increase then of literature, writing, the arts, architecture, laws, jurisprudence, liturgical reforms, scripture, Bible studies. It was a renaissance. But the other thing that happened during this time is this. All those people, the clergy especially, but then the laypersons even, were educated in this classical Christian education. Within 100 years, they were overrun by the Germanic tribes, wave after wave after wave. But their faith was so deep that even though they were overrun, they proselytized their occupiers. They were able to, and that is what gave rise to the church in Germany. Let's go a little further down history. Keep going. What does Martin Luther say about classical Christian education? Let's get to our Reformed roots here. He said this 500 years ago to the councilmen in Germany when they were trying to get things going well. If I had children, he said, and if I could manage it, I would have them study not only languages and history, but singing and music. You can see that, right? A mighty fortress. But singing and music with the whole of mathematics. The ancient Greeks, he said, trained their children in these disciplines. And they grew up to be people of wondrous ability, fit for everything. Let's talk about John Calvin. What does he say about a liberal arts education? He said, "For since all truth is of God, if any ungodly man has said anything true, we should not reject it, for it also has come from God." That was his commentary on Titus 1:12. Then in the Institutes, he said this, and he's talking about science in the Institutes. He says, "The rise of this knowledge of things terrestrial, science, first, that we may see how human nature, notwithstanding its fall, is still adorned by God with excellent endowment." So he's saying, we're learning all this science, and we see that even though man's mind has been subjected to the fall, he is still able to see amazing things and discover amazing things. So he said, therefore, in reading secular authors, the admirable light of truth displayed in them should remind us that the human mind, however much fallen and perverted from its original integrity, is still adorned and invested with admirable gifts from its creator. So read those secular authors. He says, because there is truth there, and even though the mind is fallen, God has still given them gifts. I found it fascinating. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but there are a number of things in his Institutes on that, section 15. He said, how then can we deny the truth? How then can we deny that truth must have beamed on those ancient lawgivers who arranged civil order and discipline with so much equity? Because where did democracy come from? Where did that idea come from? Shall we say that the philosophers, in their exquisite researches and skillful description of nature, were they blind? Shall we deny the possession of intellect to those who drew up rules for discourse and taught us to speak in accordance with reason, logic, and rhetoric? They were great rhetoricians, were they not? And logic. He said, shall we say that those who, by the cultivation of the medical arts, expanded in their industry in our behalf, were only raving mad? And then he goes on, the mathematical sciences and so on and so forth. He said, so shall we deem anything to be noble and praiseworthy without tracing it to the hand of God? If they said something noble and praiseworthy in those pagan writings, can we not see it is from the hand of God? That's what he says. He says, far from us be such ingratitude for not employing those liberal arts. From the early church fathers to present-day scholars, there is support for a liberal arts education. And frankly, because so much of liberal arts learning is more biblical than classical. You'll find a lot of biblical themes. So since 50% of Africans affiliate with Christianity, a Christian liberal arts tradition would transcend tribal culture. And it could strengthen the church. Because that's my history. Yes, the Abraham and Adam and Eve, that is my history. But so is this grand liberal arts Christian classical tradition, my history. That can transcend tribalism or any kind of ism. If we are what we remember, then the liberal arts would develop a common history across a multitude of people groups. So friends, it's the best education for a human being. It cultivates free societies. It's the education of the church. And it's the best education to wed with a Christian worldview. Don't try and wed anything else with a Christian worldview because classical education pursues truth. Lastly, one thing Phil Ryken said in his book on liberal arts, I was reading through that, and it was an interview about his book. It was very interesting to me what he said here. He said the liberal arts cultivates a mindset of inquiry and fosters a more thoughtful, reflective mindset. Isn't that true? If you have read some of those ancient works. And he said this. He says, this can lead to a deeper relationship with Jesus Christ because my mind is being developed as a human being to think better. And therefore, as I focus and read the scriptures, my own thinking can be deepened. I thought that was a very interesting point. So it's the best education to cultivate human flourishing. It's most suitable for human beings because we are souls, not tools. It fosters freedom from self and from domination by others. It's been the education of the church, and many of the early church fathers endorsed the liberal arts. Many people have been educated this way. One story I'd like to tell is this one. One of my new heroes is Phyllis Wheatley. I'm sure you all are familiar with her. Phyllis Wheatley was a slave girl from Senegal, Gambia, West Africa in the late 1700s. She was brought over at the age of 7. She was taught English, the English alphabet, by the daughter of the family that owned her. They noticed she was extremely bright. She was trained to be a domestic, but she did get religious and theological education by the family and the New England clergy. Her abilities were astounding and cultivated because she did get a classical Christian education. She learned to read Greek and Latin by the age of 10, Phyllis did. She read Milton, Homer, Virgil, and the scriptures. She was baptized a Christian at age, I think, 16 or 17. Phyllis Wheatley was a student of Orthodox Congregationalist theology. She wrote about natural and special revelation, the attributes of God, biblical authority, redemption, the image of God, the depravity of man, and the need for a righteous Savior. She also, because of her education, was able to communicate to people about the issue of slavery in the late 1700s. She was an abolitionist. She was a poet whose poetry was even made it into the hands of George Washington and to people in England. This little slave girl. By the time she was in her 20s, was writing incredible poetry, wrote a fantastic poem as an elegy to George Whitefield when he died. She was even supportive of mission work to Ghana and Sierra Leone. She died at the age of 30 in childbirth. Sad ending. But giving her the liberal arts education gave her a voice. Giving her the liberal arts education gave her a voice, a biblical education, and this gave her an opportunity to have this impact. They could have just left her as a domestic. God opened the doors for her to have this education. Lastly, if you don't believe that this is the best education as I have laid it out for people and for Africa, let me give you 2 more examples. There is this great education survey, the Cardis Education Survey, recognized as one of the comprehensive surveys of its kind of education of schools. They do this periodically. The Association of Classical Christian Schools finally got enough alumni after 35 years of schooling to put their alumni into this survey. So this survey, which was also conducted with Notre Dame, does this. They measure certain metrics for public schools, private evangelical schools, Catholic schools, prep schools, and homeschoolers. And now they included classical Christian schools. So they had all these different kinds of school communities and alumni from these school communities. And on every metric, the alumni from classical Christian schools performed better. And it wasn't just about they had better SAT scores. These are deep questions, and I'm just going to go through really fast what it demonstrated. The classical Christian student is better prepared for college and career. They make better grades in college. They have a more positive life outlook, get more content. They're more involved in their church and the community. They lead in their churches. They attend small group Bible studies more. They're willing to take a lower paying job so they can serve more. That's how deep these questions go. They talk about the Lord more. They They are with their families more. They pray together more. They are you need to tell the bishop this one. They're 3 times more likely to donate to their church than the others. And they respect the authority and structure of their church. These are children who graduate, these are alumni who graduated from ACCS schools compared to Catholic private schools, evangelical private schools, Christian homeschoolers, public schools, and elite prep schools. This is the fruit. This was what can happen in a classical Christian school. Spiritually, 90% of them were above the median on church attendance. They read their Bible more. They evangelize more. They are likely to be influential around them. They have a much more diverse group of friends. They're then in some ways they are more clear on their faith, yet more tolerant in the sense of others. It's an interesting, wise balance. They have a greater capacity for independent thinking. We believe classical Christian education is the best education for Africa and the world. Rose, I'm going to quote from your newsletter because I just loved how you pictured a day in the life of our schools, and all of our schools have this happening. She says, you will see children in grade 1 learning phonics. Grade 3 are introduced to writing and rhetoric. Grade 8 students are making pyramids in history class, and later in the day studying formal logic. Grade 10 is learning about famous scientists, and I will say men scientists, women scientists, African scientists, American scientists, scientists from all over. Grade 10 learning about famous scientists during biology class. Grade 11 reading Much Ado About Nothing. Grade 12 finishing their 2-year course in rhetoric. What a great thing happening in our schools. Well done, all of you, on the work you're doing.